Hello, welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Clare Nasir. In our last show on the UK's shifting springs, Gray and Madge took us into the world of birds. Today we turn to what's rooted to the spot, the plants, the trees, the lawn beneath your feet, the thing in your garden that can't pack up and follow the weather. Our guest is Peter Gibbs. You may know him as a meteorologist, a former BBC weather presenter who also spent more than 2 years in Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey. For the past 2 decades, Peter has been part of the team on BBC Radio 4's Gardener's Question Time, the longest continuously running show of its kind in the world. As Peter puts it, your success or failure in the garden has as much to do with the weather as it does with your skill. And the weather is changing. A famous 2022 research paper, the Bunt-Gent study, tracked more than 400,000 records of 406 flowering plant species in the UK over nearly 3 centuries. The finding is significant. UK plants are now flowering a full month earlier than the long-term average. But what does that actually look like in your garden? Peter has the answers. He talks about the cruelty of mild winters followed by April frosts. The plants we can suddenly grow that our grandparents couldn't. The plants we may be about to lose. The quiet collapse of dormancy. He touches on citizen science and adaptation. Peter stood on a vast Antarctic ice shelf, yet still believes a single garden can matter. Alex Burkill caught up with Peter in his own garden.
Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. I can see you're enjoying your garden at the moment, but many people, I for example, know you as a weather presenter, but now you spend most of your time talking about gardening as well. That's been a bit of a transition.
Yeah, I guess it has really. Although, of course, you know, weather and gardening go together incredibly well. Your year's success or failure in the garden has as much to do with the weather, I think, as it does with how skilled you are as a gardener in many ways. So I've always had that interest and had that interest for many, many years. But I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to join the team at Gardener's Question Time, Radio 4, the longest continuous running radio show in the world, would you believe, Alex?
Oh, wow.
It started in 1947. Yeah. So we've got a very big birthday coming up next year. And yeah, it's allowed me to combine those 2 passions, weather and gardening.
So obviously the show's then been going for a long time and you've been doing it for a long period of time. Have you seen, with our changing climate, the kind of questions that people are asking, the topics you're covering, has there been a shift over recent years?
Yeah, definitely. 1 or 2 shifts really over the time I've been doing. I've been doing the show for about 20 years now. Definitely a trend towards more questions about how to garden in a more nature-friendly way. So moving away from chemicals, just being a little bit kinder in the garden. But yeah, definitely weather related. And I would say probably in that context, the thing we get asked about most now is how to deal with weather extremes. So winter wet and summer drought and heat, which of course is, you know, that's been kind of the long-term climate prediction for the UK for quite some time now, hasn't it? And gardeners are definitely noticing that that's the way things are now beginning to pan out. And it's really tricky because plants that will deal with having their feet really wet during the winter then don't necessarily deal very well with drought during the summer, and vice versa. Plants like Mediterranean plants, lavender, for example, which loves it hot and dry, absolutely hates being soaking wet through the winter. So it's a really difficult combination to deal with, and gardeners, amateurs and professionals alike, are really, I think, struggling to really get a handle on that and work out just how we're going to go forward.
So what advice are you able to give? And are there any, hopeful signs of like any measures that are being taken to help gardeners, farmers, for example?
Well, there's that absolute adage in gardening. It's right plant for the right place. So you have to think about what conditions a particular plant likes and then try and find that spot in your garden that's going to match that. And it's incredible how varied the microclimates can be within a relatively small garden, from hot and dry in one corner to maybe damp and shady in another. So understanding how your garden responds to the weather and the climate is quite a key part of it. But then giving the plants the best possible chance to thrive. So making sure the soil's in good heart, so they've got a fair chance. And if it is something like lavender, say, that really hates being soggy at the roots, then maybe think about lifting the planting. So planting on a mound, for example, so that the winter wet drains away to some extent, but then it's still quite happy during the summer. And also maybe sourcing plants from different parts of the world where maybe the climate is a bit more analogous to the direction our climate is heading as well.
Are there any parts of the world that you know that fit that bill that we could be maybe looking at already?
There's a lot of people have been looking at this. Foresters, for example, who are having to make decisions now, planting trees that they still want to be around 50, 100, maybe even 150 years into the future in the case of things like oaks. So if they get it wrong now, that's an awfully big mistake to have made if everything dies in 20, 30 years' time. But also horticulturists as well are trying to source these sort of areas. And things seem to point to some extent towards the Caucasus region. So that area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, places like Georgia, for example, which certainly have hotter summers than we have at the moment. Exactly. And because they're still reasonably close to big bodies of water, they do get a little bit of influence from that as well. So it seems to be at the moment about the closest we can get to what we might be seeing in a few decades' time, or even a little bit sooner. I mean, things I would say are perhaps changing faster than we were anticipating. Certainly that's what gardeners seem to feel.
And what kind of interesting plants could we adopt from those areas then?
I knew you were going to ask me that. And yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer that one, unfortunately, because it's still early. It's still early days in that.
Yeah, that's fine. Now, we're already seeing quite dramatic shifts when it comes to plants across the UK. Many of them are flowering around a month earlier, herbs even more than that. What does that actually look to a UK gardener?
Yeah, I think you're probably referring to there was a study came out of Cambridge University recently, wasn't there?
Yeah, the Burkill study.
That's it. That looked at average flowering times over as long a period as they could actually get records for. Yeah, it seemed to tie in pretty much with what we're seeing in the gardens, which is a growing season, probably extended by about a month overall. And obviously that ties in with things flowering earlier. You mentioned herbs as being the ones that had shifted most. I think in that study, basically they called herbs anything that wasn't a tree or a shrub. So it's a bit of a technical term. It encompasses not just things like parsley and rosemary and so on. It's most of the garden plants that we're familiar with. Herbaceous perennials, for example, the ones that go dormant over the winter, come back again in the spring. But a lot of the annuals as well. And I think it was mentioned that because they have a high turnover, they might be able to evolve essentially a little bit quicker than some other plants in the changing conditions. So because if you're going through one generation every year, then I suppose there's more chance for natural selection perhaps to have some effect. But yeah, I mean, flowering a month earlier in some cases, it's quite dramatic, isn't it? Particularly when, I mean, that's happened essentially over my lifetime, really. And when you think that's only an average temperature change of what, just over about a degree? That's right, isn't it, for the UK roughly. Average temperature? Yeah. It doesn't sound a lot, does it? And yet you've got that massive change in the natural world. And gardeners are certainly seeing that, and we're hearing that in the questions. They're also seeing it in terms of milder winters and things just not really going dormant. So roses, for example, staying evergreen right the way through the winter, even flowering right into the early part of the winter. There was a lot of talk about daffodils coming out at ridiculous times earlier this year. So yeah, it feels sometimes like everything's getting a bit out of whack in the garden, and you're not quite sure what's going to pop up next.
And that early growth can cause problems, can't it? So you talked about things not going dormant. That can be a problem with pests and issues. But then also with early growth and then a late frost. We still get frosts in April. We've had some frost this April. But if the plants have flowered and come out earlier, then they can get killed off or damaged by those late frosts more than if they'd held on for that little bit longer. Is that something that's becoming more of an issue when you talk to your listeners?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you mentioned dormancy there. That can be a problem in terms of plants not performing very well when they do wake up. It's like us. If we don't get a very good night's sleep, don't go to sleep properly, you don't perform very well the next day. Exactly. So if a plant hasn't had a proper spell of dormancy over the winter, it hasn't got the same vigor to really get going in the spring. So that might become an increasing problem. And as you say about frost, it's really interesting. I saw a study that found that frosts, as we might expect, because the climate's warmed, have reduced by something like, well, in my part of the world, I'm not far from Reading, by about a quarter overall through the year. But interestingly, it's not an even reduction. So there's a lot fewer frosts now in the autumn, so November, December time, which is a time when we're not too bothered about frost as a gardener, because everything's starting to go to sleep anyway. But the frequency of frosts in the spring months, which is when you are worried about it as a gardener, hasn't really reduced that much. So exactly as you say, the milder winters pushing things into flower, like fruit trees, for example, and then the frosts still coming with just about the same sort of frequency, absolutely can hammer that early blossom, and then that means you've knocked your fruit crop on the head for that year.
Which is pretty well. It's devastating for some gardeners, but also devastating for some businesses, which must be really struggling. So it's important that measures are taken to try and cope with this, mitigate it, but also people are aware of how things are going to progress going forward, and so that you can look to the future and see if there are things like picking different crops and different plants, as you mentioned before. Now, I've heard about hazel emerging as a sort of sentinel species, if you will. When it comes, its flowering has advanced by around 10 days. In fact, you see some hazels now flowering in December. Is this a sort of canary when it comes to how other plants around the UK could be acting?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I do actually, I'll pop down to the corner of the garden here. Hopefully you'll be able to follow me. I have actually got a hazel, which, to be honest, is quite unusual for gardens. Most gardens, it's not a plant that would tend to grow because it's a bit boring, to be honest. It doesn't have nice flowers. It doesn't have nice autumn colour. It doesn't have much in the way of fruit. So unless you've got a nuttery and you actually want it for the nuts, then it's not an amazing sort of plant to have in the garden. But yeah, there is one here. I think you can see it. The leaves are nicely out already. I actually grow it came in here by itself, probably brought in by a squirrel burying a nut somewhere, or a jay. But I've actually left it because it's quite useful in this corner, and I coppice it. So I let it grow up for a couple of years, get these nice sort of stems, which are nice and bendy, cut those off, and use them for things like bean poles. So it's really quite useful. Interestingly, I've been getting into more sort of conservation work. Oh, there's a bit of a gust of wind blowing things over. I've been getting into more conservation work since retiring. And coppicing hazel is one of the things we do because different growth stages of hazel are useful for different types of wildlife. And we definitely noticed there that the buds are breaking on the hazel earlier and earlier over the years. And I've also got into a bit of hedge laying, which is a hobby of mine as well, alongside the conservation work. And hedge layers are saying that actually the season they can work, because they really only properly want to do hedge laying while the plants are dormant. And that period has shrunk because they're going to dormancy later in the autumn, and things like hazel are shooting away again so early in the spring. So yeah, it's it's a bit of an issue, and it's certainly a sign of how things are changing. Again, a good month or more earlier in most cases than it used to be a few decades ago.
That's really interesting, and I'm fascinated by, because I'm not that green-fingered myself, I'm fascinated by how you can coppice and utilise the trees within your garden for other things that I just hadn't really thought of. Now, on Costing the Earth and in your own talks, you talk about how gardening's changed with climate change. Thinking about your own patch where you are at the moment, are there things in your garden that you're now able to grow that seemed unthinkable a couple of decades ago?
I've certainly changed what I grow, and I would say it's as much about what I don't grow now as what I do grow that I didn't, if you see what I mean.
I understand, yeah.
And a lot of the don't grow bit is because of the dryness. I talked about having a little weather station. I only recorded 420 millimetres of rain in the whole year last year here in East Berkshire.
Wait, say that again, sorry?
I recorded just 420 millimetres of rain in total.
In the whole year?
In my garden. In the whole year.
Yeah, that's going to cause problems.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And of course, the third less rainfall, because I should have somewhere near 600 on average, was during the main sort of growing season. So once the plants had used up the moisture that was in the ground from winter, they were really starting to struggle. So I've moved away from plants that tend to like a lot of water and need to stay damp. It's not helped by the fact that I'm on a soil on top of chalk. So once the aquifer drops, the water level in the chalk, that's it. There's nothing coming up from below. So things like a stilby, I suppose, which likes a fairly moist sort of soil. I really have stopped persevering with that. One or two of the other herbaceous perennials as well. In terms of what I grow that I didn't used to, well, there's a couple of things. Canners, which is a real tropical looking plant, not surprisingly, because it comes from subtropical regions of North and Central America. It used to be a plant that you had to really cosset. So you'd have to take it in, dig it up and take it in. It grows from sort of large tubers. Dig it up, take it in for the winter, and then start it off again in the spring inside in a greenhouse or whatever, and then plant it out. I now leave it in the soil year round. Now it's a little bit of a risk. I've actually got some just popping through down here. So if I go down here, hopefully you can see those little shoots.
Oh yeah.
They're actually the canner just starting to come up. So they're a bit slower than they would be if I brought them on in a greenhouse or whatever. But, you know, they're surviving through the winter. Now, if we had a really nasty cold winter, which we can still get, of course, even with a warming climate as a one-off, then they might not make it. But the majority of the time, they are making it through. And actually, just at the end of this bed, now this is something that it would have been okay to grow before. Can you see this big palm just behind me there? Big palm tree?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a Mediterranean fan palm, Chimerops humilis, it's called. Now that is actually hardy. It'll take temperatures down to -5, maybe even -10. So it's not been a problem with frost in the past. You have been able to grow it in the UK, but if you didn't have the heat in the summer, it would stay relatively small. This one's been in for about 15 years, and it's now, well, if I got to the top, that's about 12 feet tall. So it's getting towards, it's amazing. It's getting towards the sort of sizes that you would see it growing in its natural habitat in the Mediterranean. So it's that sort of thing. Things like that are doing much better than they used to in the UK. Trees like pomegranates, for example, in London, certainly with the heat island effect, you're getting towards the point where you might actually be able to get fruit from a pomegranate tree because the heat is enough in the summer to ripen the wood, which is what you need to actually produce the blossom to get the fruits. So they're the sort of changes that we're seeing. It's what we can't grow, and it's increasing what we are able to grow as well.
So that's actually quite encouraging that there are lots of things that we couldn't grow in the past, but now we can. Like I really like pomegranates, and so I'm considering now trying to go out and grow a pomegranate tree in my back garden. It won't go well, but
good one.
Yeah, thank you. But now at this time of year, it's spring, and when I think of spring and April in particular, I think bluebells, and going to look at them and the sea of blue. But they're being impacted by climate change, aren't they? Because again, like with many things, they're flowering earlier, but then also they're getting impacted by the early leaf of the canopy above them, which is causing problems. Do you think that picturesque view of a sea of blue that we think of when we think of spring, do you think that's at risk?
Oh, I certainly hope not, Alex. We've got some fantastic bluebell woods in this part of the world, particularly out in the Chilterns, and it's just glorious at this time of the year. I have to say, anecdotally, having been here for the best part of 30 years in this area now, I feel actually they're doing perhaps even better than they were 25, 30 years ago. I think they seem to have expanded in the woods that I visit regularly. There's definitely a race going on, as you say, between the bluebells flowering earlier because of the warmer winters and the leaf canopy coming in a bit earlier as well. But that race, I don't know, just seems to be in balance from what I'm seeing. Now, it may be in the future when we get above a certain threshold that balance tips the wrong way. That's a hard one to predict. I know that bluebell seeds, so once they've gone to seed, they do need a chilling period to ensure germination. So maybe that's where the risk might come from. It's one of those where if they're not getting that chill through the winter to tell them, okay, we've had the winter now, it's time to spring into life and germinate, that might be one of the threats perhaps looking further ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I also hope that they don't suffer because they're so picturesque and so beautiful. It's lovely to see them. We have loads near us as well, which is fantastic. And I agree, actually. I've noticed them more. Maybe I'm more aware of them now than I was 10 years ago or so. But I feel that I'm seeing them in more places where I'd never noticed them previously. Maybe it's because I have young kids. I have to be outside more often. Who knows?
Well, it's a good thing for you.
Well, it's really exactly. Good for you. Yeah, it is a very good thing. The lack of sleep, less so, but the fresh air and being outside, it's good for me. Now the RHS talks about gardening in a changing climate, and we've talked about the milder winters leading to a longer growing season. But our extremes can be more unpredictable. So, there are some benefits perhaps, but do you think the cost or the cons will outweigh the pros?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I think there's just so many unknowns. We're moving into uncharted territory because one thing we always have to keep remembering is, the temperature is going to change, has changed, and will continue to change unless we switch off carbon emissions tomorrow. But the daylight hasn't changed. We've still got exactly the same day lengths as we ever used to. So we really just don't know in a lot of cases how plants are going to respond to higher temperatures, but in the same sort of light regime. Because, temperature is a big driver for plant growth, but with some plants, light day length is a driver as well, is a factor. I know there are some plants that actually the flowering or the leaf burst is inhibited until the days reach a certain length during the spring. And that's evolved because if you put your flowers out too early, they were going to get frosted in the year. It's to not get caught out by a little burst of warmth in the late winter, early part of the spring. That's why there is this photoperiodism sort of laid on top of it. So who knows how those two things are going to interact and play out, you know, over the next decade or two. It's full of unknowns. So I think all we can do as gardeners is just keep observing, see what's doing well, see what's not doing well. As I say, right plant, right place, and just keep learning. Just keep learning, because none of us know exactly how this is going to go.
And sharing knowledge and looking, like you mentioned, to other areas and seeing the type of plants that are growing well there, and bring them this way. I like it. I like the future forward thinking from that side. Now back to you, Peter. Your career is taking you many places. I believe you've been in Antarctica, where temperatures are like -40 during the winter darkness, and then you're talking about how we can now grow olive trees in Yorkshire. Now, how have we got from one, or how have you gone from one to the other? Is there a line that you can draw between the two?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I spent 2 years living and working in Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey. So on a flat white plain of ice on an ice shelf, I didn't actually see a green living thing apart from a frozen pea for 2.5 years. So very, very different to what I've ended up doing later in life. And now, as you say, you know, I'm involved in broadcasting and gardening. Is there a line? I guess there is in some ways. You know, Antarctica, it certainly felt like the last real wilderness. Living there, you felt it was a place that was completely untouched by what we were doing to the planet, that it hadn't changed from before people were there. It was like a glimpse back into the primeval earth. Whereas in an environment like this, in a garden, you know, there couldn't really be a more manipulated environment in many ways. But now, of course, we're finding that we are having an impact in Antarctica. It's not untouchable. Ice shelves are starting to be affected by melt from below, from warmer water coming in from lower latitudes. We're seeing dramatic ice loss on the peninsula, where temperatures have risen more than most other parts of the world. So we are having an impact even in that part of the world. And we're having an impact here too, but we always have had. But I think, you know, there's a lot of talk about eco-anxiety and just the feeling that it's all too big. Do you get that it's all too big? What can I do about it as an individual? And I think, to be honest, the garden is a place where maybe you feel like you can make a bit of a difference. You know, try and work with nature, try and make it nature friendly, encourage wildlife into your garden, lock up carbon in the soil by making the soil a good, healthy place for microorganisms, lock up carbon in the trees and the shrubs in your garden. You know, it's a small contribution, but if we all do it, then it has some impact.
Are there any other tips that you could give any wannabe gardeners of how they could, make the most of their garden and have the greatest impact possible?
In terms of wildlife, certainly. The best thing you can do is bring a bit of water into the garden. Now, I'm very fortunate. We inherited a good-sized pond in our garden, and it is an absolute delight. I've had some years over 60 dragonflies hatch out of that fairly modest pond. It's full of newts for the year. It's just incredible. It's so full of life. But, you know, not everybody's got a garden big enough to have something like that in. But even a sink or a bucket will actually attract some wildlife. So you can definitely do that. Let some bits go untidy. Behind the summer house there behind me, I've allowed nettles to grow, and nettles are great food for some of our favourite butterfly species, for the caterpillars. You know, we love the butterflies. As gardeners, we don't always like the caterpillars quite so much because they eat some of our plants. But you've got to make room for those as well. So a bit of untidiness here and there in the garden. But, you know, this is a wildlife friendly garden, but it doesn't look wild, does it? You know, it looks reasonably maintained. It's a lot of work to keep it that way. I warn you, if you're thinking of getting into gardening.
Thanks for the warning. Okay.
Yeah, it will take over your life. It helps being retired, Alex, that's for sure. But you don't have to have a wild garden for it to be wildlife friendly. And things like don't use chemicals, use peat-free compost, because peat bogs are better than rainforests, as we know, for actually holding carbon. So we don't really want to be digging them up just to plant up a few plants in our garden. So yeah, lots of things you can do, even on a small scale, that will make a difference.
And whilst we're on the topic of advice for gardeners, are there any tips or things that gardeners can look out for to see how our climate is changing? Anything that you could suggest that they look out for?
Well, we talked a lot about flowering times, haven't we? And people have been doing that for quite a long time, recording times of events in nature. It's called phenology, the timing of events in nature. Things like the first swallows arriving. I haven't actually seen one here yet. I'm waiting for the swifts to arrive as well. But first leaf burst coming out when the buds open in the spring. Because all these things are proven to be, where records have been kept, really useful indicators of how the climate is changing. I know there's been a lot of studies looking into that. The Woodland Trust actually runs something on their website where you can actually feed in observations of things like first bluebell flowering during the spring. So have a look at that. Nature's Calendar, it's called. And even just keep some records in your own garden. There was a great example I came across of a lady called Jean Coombs, who lived in Surrey, who just decided for some reason as a teenager back in 1947 that she was going to go out around her local woods and record the date that the first oak leaves came out, lime leaves, 2 or 3 other species of tree as well. And she kept that going for the rest of her life.
Oh, wow.
And that has given us, it's amazing. It's that dedication. What made her do it? I really don't know. But, you know, that record, which continued through until her death just 2 or 3 years ago now, has shown us that oak, for example, is now coming into leaf a month earlier than it did back in 1947. And we wouldn't really know that without somebody like that keeping those records. So these citizen science records can be really, really valuable.
That's really interesting that she had the foresight to do that, because I can't imagine decades ago many people were aware that things were changing as drastically as it's been shown by her studies. Peter, there's been a worrying trend over recent years of people ripping up their lawns and changing them for AstroTurf, artificial grass. That's damaging and that's causing impacts. How do you feel about that?
Personally, I really wouldn't do it. Don't ever mention that to the panel on Gardeners Question Time, because they get very, very cross. Any mention of AstroTurf, or there's even things like fake hedges now as well that you could just stick in on your boundary. They're all made of plastic, of course, which is really not good news these days, to be sticking that sort of stuff in the garden. I get it. If you're really busy, as most people are, you might have young children, you might have dogs that you want to get out in the garden and not have to worry about it turning into a mud bath in the winter. I understand why people might go down that route. But I also hear that a lot of people do actually regret it, because they're not quite what they're cracked up to be. They get incredibly hot in the summer, too hot for dogs' feet in many cases. They start to look yeah, it's not great. And from an environmental point of view, you've got the disposal issue when it does become worn out, which the cheaper stuff wears out after just a few short years. There's also talked about it getting hot. In urban areas, the more hard surfaces you have, the hotter things get in the summer. So things like gardens, green surfaces, are actually a good way to help offset that, to keep things that little bit cooler. So particularly as the climate continues to warm, surfaces like that are just more and more and more of a problem. So yeah, not a fan. I wish people wouldn't, but equally, I do understand why some people do.
Yeah, I get it as well, but it is frustrating when I see some of my friends and family doing it. I'm like, have you thought about the long-term effects?
And yeah, I would say just don't be precious about a lawn. I've got grass, but it's full of weeds. When we have long dry spells, I just leave it to go brown, because once it rains again, if it ever is going to rain again, as I look round at some just small cumulus overhead, which is all we've been seeing recently, then it comes back to life eventually. So don't be precious about it. Leave it long as well. Don't feel you have to mow it every 5 minutes. You leave it a bit longer, it's much more resilient.
Now, Peter, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been really interesting. You have inspired me. I am going to maybe give me a year or so, but I am going to turn my garden into something that's much better for the planet, much better for the wildlife as well. I'll go stick a sink in it today, ready as a water feature. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
It's been great fun. Thanks a lot, Alex. It's a great topic, and it's an important one as well for all of us, I think.
Huge thanks to Peter Gibbs for his time, for his insight, and for the tour of his garden. If you haven't yet seen part 1 of Shifting Springs with Graham Madge on the world of birds, do go back and catch it. The two halves belong together. Full references for every study mentioned in this episode are in the show notes below. I'm Clare Nasir. Thank you for joining us on Climate Conversations. See you next time.